Colton chose the mountains because they didn't ask questions. They didn't care who he had been, what he had done, or how many years of his life had been spent moving through places where violence was a tool rather than an accident. The land accepted effort and offered silence in return. For a long time, that was enough. He built his cabin where the road thinned into a suggestion and then disappeared altogether, hauled water from a spring, split his own wood, learned the patterns of weather the way other people learn schedules. Out there, time behaved differently. It slowed, stretched, lost its edges. Responsibility, or what passed for it, was simple. Keep yourself alive, don't take more than you needed, leave the rest alone. That had been the point. Not hiding, exactly. More like stepping sideways out of a world that had learned how to consume people who were good at hard things and then discard them once the work was done. Colton wasn't running from guilt so much as exhaustion. He had followed orders long enough to understand where that road led, and he had chosen deliberately to stop walking it. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of tire tracks. They cut across a section of his land near the lower ridge, deep and fresh, pressed into soil that should have been untouched. Colton crouched beside them, fingers brushing the edges, eyes tracing the pattern automatically. Heavy vehicle. Repeated passes. Not lost hikers. Not a hunter straying off a trail. Trespassing was irritating, but it wasn't unusual. People assumed empty land belonged to no one, or worse, that it was available to whoever had the nerve to use it. Colton filed it away, set a trail camera, and told himself it would end there. It didn't. Within a week, he found evidence of timber cutting near the creek. Clean cuts. Efficient work. Too organized for opportunists. He followed the signs carefully, keeping distance, letting the forest tell the story. What he found wasn't just illegal logging. It was infrastructure. Temporary roads camouflaged with brush. A small warehouse tucked into a fold of land that shouldn't have held anything but trees. Colton stood at the edge of it, watching from cover, and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, planned, resourced. Whatever was happening here wasn't meant to be seen, and it certainly wasn't meant to be small. He began documenting. Not because he had decided to intervene, but because that was how his mind worked when confronted with uncertainty. He took photographs, logged times, mapped movement. At night, he reviewed the footage, pausing frame by frame. Trucks came and went at odd hours. Crates were loaded, sealed, transferred. Workers rotated frequently, faces changing, routines consistent. Animals started disappearing. At first it was subtle. A trail that went quiet. A bear track that didn't return. Then it became undeniable. Snares. Traps. Signs of butchering. Colton followed one trail too far and found a holding area, makeshift pens hidden beneath netting, where live animals were kept just long enough to be processed and moved. That was when the problem stopped being theoretical. Wildlife trafficking wasn't new. Colton knew that. He'd seen its edges in other places, heard about markets and routes and money that flowed like water around laws and borders. But seeing it here, embedded in the land he had chosen because it was supposed to be untouched, changed the equation. He didn't sleep much after that. Instead, he worked. He stayed methodical, forcing himself not to jump ahead, not to let anger dictate pace. He reminded himself that whatever this was, the men he could see were not the core of it. They were labor. Replaceable. There was someone else, somewhere else, who made decisions and never set foot in the dirt. Catching trespassers wouldn't stop it. Burning the warehouse wouldn't stop it. The only way to end something like this was to remove the center of gravity, the person or structure everything else depended on. He called Bryn on the third night, using a satellite phone he kept for emergencies and tried not to think about. Bryn listened without interrupting, asked a few precise questions, and then gave Colton a name. Morrison. Fish and Wildlife Service. Federal. The meeting happened 2 days later, off the mountain, in a place that felt uncomfortably crowded after weeks of trees and sky. Morrison was older than Colton expected, with a kind of calm that came from having seen a lot and survived it without illusions. He listened carefully, reviewed the evidence, asked how Colton had gathered it. When Colton finished, Morrison leaned back and nodded once. "This is interstate," he said. "Which means it's bigger than you think." Colton didn't argue. He already knew. Morrison explained the reality of it. RICO cases took time. Months of documentation. Financial trails. Connections solid enough to hold in court. Acting too early would scatter the operation, not destroy it. Colton felt the conflict settle into him like a weight. Waiting meant more animals dead. More damage done. But rushing meant the whole thing would grow back somewhere else, stronger and more careful.
He nodded anyway.
Tell me what you need. That was when the investigation changed shape. Colton shifted away from watching the forest and toward watching paper. He pulled public records, corporate filings, property transactions. He mapped shell companies the way he once mapped terrain, looking for patterns, for repetition disguised as randomness. Land bought in cash. Liens paid off quietly. Ownership transferred just often enough to obscure continuity.
The names changed. The structure didn't.
He followed the money as far as public information would allow, then farther, through court records from unrelated cases where banking details had surfaced accidentally. Eventually, everything converged.
Offshore wires. Repeated intermediaries. One beneficiary. Nadia Orlova. Russian national. Seattle address.
No visible business. No income that matched the scale of assets tied, indirectly, to the land acquisitions and logistics hubs Colton had identified. When he handed the file to Morrison, the room went quiet. This, Morrison said slowly, is the top. From that moment on, Colton was no longer just observing. He was designated a confidential informant. His name entered systems he had hoped never to see again. With that came protection, warnings, and a truth he accepted without protest. He was now a liability to the people he had uncovered. The surveillance began subtly. A vehicle parked too long at the end of his road. A drone he hadn't launched, visible only because he knew where to look.
Colton didn't panic. He adapted.
He adjusted routines, reinforced positions, cleared blind spots. He prepared not because he wanted a fight, but because he understood what came next. An emissary arrived 3 weeks later.
Polite. Well-dressed.
The kind of man who spoke softly because he was used to being heard.
He offered money.
Enough to make most problems disappear. Framed it as business.
As efficiency.
Colton declined without ceremony. He told the man the evidence existed in multiple locations, that any harm would only accelerate federal action. The emissary listened, nodded, and left. The silence afterward was worse than the offer. Colton slept lightly, one eye open, waiting for the pattern to complete itself. He knew how these things worked. Negotiation failed.
Silence followed. Then action. It came just before dawn.
Vehicles without plates. Movement coordinated, professional. They approached carefully, assuming they were unseen.
Colton let them come. He needed intent. He needed clarity.
When they breached the perimeter and fired after he issued warnings, the line was crossed. He moved then, fast and controlled, using terrain and preparation rather than brute force.
Non-lethal tools. Disabling shots. Traps designed to contain, not kill.
It was over quickly. When law enforcement arrived, the evidence was indisputable.
Armed assault. Coordinated action.
Clear retaliation against a federal informant. What months of patience hadn't achieved, hours of necessity did. The task force assembled with urgency. Raids were planned and executed simultaneously. Camps, warehouses, offices. Leadership taken by surprise. Records seized.
Money frozen.
Nadia Orlova was arrested in Seattle that same night. The legal process dragged, as it always did. Colton testified calmly, factually. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as a vigilante, but the documentation told a different story. The restraint mattered. The evidence mattered. Eventually, faced with overwhelming proof, Orlova accepted a deal.
Decades in prison. Assets forfeited.
Cooperation that rippled outward, leading to arrests in other countries, other forests. When it was done, truly done, Colton returned to the mountain and listened. The land was quieter at first, then slowly alive again.
Tracks returned. Birds nested.
The forest healed with an efficiency that humbled him. Colton understood then that isolation had never been the point. The mountains hadn't erased his past. They had refined it. When the call came asking for help on another case, he said yes without hesitation. Some things, he had learned, were worth stepping back into the world for.